Right. So we need to understand how the UK's GDP has, or per capita, which means per person, has changed over time. Okay. So first we need to understand is that from sort of 1200s right up until sort of middle of the 1700s, there was actually very little change relatively in the amount of money, the gross domestic product per person in the UK. Now, this is because the economy and the kinds of jobs people did and the way people worked didn't actually vary very much. So to start with, throughout all of this period of time, the vast majority of people, probably about 80 to 90% of the working people in the country were employed in the primary sector. Now, the primary sector involves jobs that are to do with the extraction or production of raw materials. So, mostly people at this stage would have been working in farming, okay? And they would have been maybe having small farms which grew enough food for themselves. And if they had any surplus, so any extra, they would take that to market and they could trade it or exchange it for other products that they needed. So, in this society, in this very traditional society, there's very little revenue, there's very little money actually being generated because you're just looking to provide for you and your family, and if you have excess, that's lucky. The labour, the work is mostly done by people. Maybe you have some animals if you're lucky to help you, but mostly it's about people working on the land in the primary sector. Um, so we can see here very little change throughout this period of time. Now, um, during the 1800s, this was the start of a period of time, sort of from 1800s to I guess the sort of after the Second World War, the mid 1950s, known as the Industrial Revolution. So during this time, um, there was huge advancements in technology, particularly around engines. And what engines allowed was they allowed um, work to happen much more efficiently and effectively. We didn't need people essentially to do those jobs. We now had engines and machines that could do those jobs for us. So things like steam engines could move the products around. You could now things like even the cars and lorries were started to be developed, which could meant you rather than just trading with your local people, your local community in a market, you could trade much more widely, and that meant people could earn more money from their products. And we also saw around this time um, factories, and the Industrial Revolution was all about that. It was about a change in the dominant type of work from primary farming jobs to secondary industry, which is factory jobs. Um, and that meant people left their villages where they worked on their farms and they moved to cities and towns where they would work in factories. And these jobs um, had paid higher incomes, which meant that more people had more money was being generated and more taxes were being paid. And it also meant those businesses were also having to pay taxes as well. Um, so that helped the GDP grow. Now, once we had factories, we could produce lots more of products and we could sell those more widely, but we could also sell those to other countries. So during the 1800s and the 1900s was a period of real globalization, which means increasing connectivity with other countries. So, and during this time, we had the British Empire was in the growth stage. And it was in what's called as the mercantilist phase, where we were looking to be merchants, we were looking to buy, and we were looking to sell. Um, so what we would do is we would conquer, we would invade other countries, we extract their natural resources, their primary resources, we'd bring them back to the UK, and then in our factories, in our secondary industries, we produce secondary manufactured goods that then could be sold for a higher wage. So we'd extract cotton from India and we could then make it into cloth and then we could sell it all over the world. And this saw our GDP start to grow very, very rapidly to a point that even global forces, which you can't see here because it's hidden by this little box, such as World War One and World War Two, didn't massively or dramatically shift this global upward trajectory of our GDP. And this rate of change is known as exponential. That means it's increasing at an increasing rate. And that's because as we become more wealthy, that wealth creates more wealth, and GDP and higher GDP creates even higher GDP. And this is because from the sort of 1950s onwards, globalization meant that those factories could now move to other countries. We could move to countries such as China and India, where they could produce those manufactured resources for cheaper products, and improvements in technology, improvements in transport meant that they could then be sold all over the world. And that means there was more and more people to buy them, more and more profit could be made, more and more trade was happening, which meant the GDP was growing. Um, and as those factories went to other countries, it also meant that the people in the UK were free to do other jobs. So from the 1950s onwards, the majority of people in the UK have been employed in what's known as the tertiary sector. Now, the tertiary sector, sometimes known as the service sector, is jobs like teachers, doctors, lawyers, bankers, these are retail, chefs. These are jobs where you provide a service for people. And these jobs, again, traditionally demand a higher wage, a higher income. And those businesses are also generating higher profits, which means that the GDP of the country continues to increase. So, and all the time, we've got again changes and improvements and increasing interconnectivity of selling to more people, we're producing more products. So the GDP continues to go upwards. Now, this was what can be sometimes seen in what's known as Rostow's model, where he says countries start out as a traditional sort of farming society where they trade just with their neighbors if they have extra. Then maybe they start to have factories and machines and automation where machines are doing the jobs of people, which allows them to move into this transitional stage. Then stage three, that's our industrial revolution. That's where factories are producing lots and lots of materials which can then be sold all over the world, and the GDP starts to grow much faster. That then starts to slow down, but it's still increasing as those countries move to a more tertiary driven services jobs. And then finally, you get to a stage where the UK would be considered as high mass consumption. That means we are using and consuming lots and lots of resources, and we have a highly developed, and we have a high GDP as a country, and also a high GDP per capita. So I hope that all makes sense.